In the closing stages of the 1980s Afghan War, the Soviet Spetsnaz received an almost divine wonder weapon that no one had ever seen before. The VSS Vintorez completely redefined DMRs for covert close-range ambushes. It was terrifying in PUBG, excellent in Escape from Tarkov, and can be seen in 1,000 other video games. However, most people underrate just how good this gun truly was and how scary it was during the Soviet-Afghan War to its modern-day use with the Russian Spetsnaz. So that's what you'll hear today. But just a heads up before we get into it, what happened to those on the wrong end of a VSS Vintorez you probably won't forget. You see, by the late 1970s, the Soviet Spetsnaz had a problem that kept getting uglier with every passing year. Their whole job was to slip far behind enemy lines, find something that mattered, and wreck it before anyone knew they were ever there. We are talking about teams dropped deep inside NATO territory to knock out command posts, blow up airfields, and in some plans even hunt down nuclear missile launchers before they could fire. For work that deep, getting spotted meant getting killed, so going unheard mattered to them more than firepower ever did. To pull it off, they carried a normal Kalashnikov with a screw-on suppressor and special slow bullets, and for a while, that setup did the trick. But that silencer worked through soft rubber discs that got chewed up a little more with every shot. So after just a few magazines, it started leaking noise, and the slow round behind it had barely more punch than a pistol anyway. Then NATO troops started turning up in better and better body armor, and suddenly those quiet rounds just slapped against it or stopped dead. So the Spetsnaz were stuck with a brutal trade-off. They could be quiet, or they could beat armor, but no weapon on earth let them do both in the same breath. And that single impossible demand is what would eventually give birth to one of the scariest rifles ever made. The job of solving it landed on TsNIITochMash, a secretive institute near Moscow that had been tinkering with silent killing for decades, ever since its engineers took apart a captured suppressed pistol pulled from the wreck of an American U-2 spy plane downed over the Soviet Union in 1960. So when the command finally ordered a proper fix, the work landed in exactly the right hands, and it got serious in 1983. The wish list they were handed sounded almost like a wind-up. The new weapon had to be whisper quiet. It should rip through NATO body armor with a range of up to 400 meters. On top of that, it needed to break apart and tuck inside a small case, so an operator could stroll through a city carrying it and not turn a single head. You see, no normal bullet could tick all those boxes at once, so before anyone could even build a gun, they first had to invent a brand new round from scratch. A team of engineers necked out an old 7.62 rifle case to swallow a fat 9mm bullet, and out came the 9x39mm cartridge. The bullet was a proper monster, heavy and slow, weighing about 16 grams, which is roughly double the bullet in an ordinary AK-47 round. And that heaviness was the whole clever bit, because the round crawled out of the barrel at only about 290 meters a second, comfortably under the speed of sound, so it made no crack as it flew, and nothing in the air gave the shooter away. They cooked up two versions of the round, the SP5 with a plain core for accuracy, and the SP6 with a hardened steel core for tearing through armor. Up close, that armor-piercing SP6 could go through about 8mm of solid steel, and even out at 200 meters, it would still defeat a soft body armor vest or 30 layers of Kevlar. The SP5 even hid a tiny air pocket up in its nose, so that when the heavy slug hit a body, it would tumble and tear sideways instead of punching a clean little hole. And because that fat round left the barrel so gently, the rifle barely kicked, so an operator could ride the recoil and drop a second man almost exactly where the first one fell. So the Soviets had fixed the round problem, but now they had an even bigger one. How do you build a rifle that could fire it? The man who pulled it all together was a designer named Peter Serdyukov, and what he built looked like nothing the West had ever put their eyes on. The whole front half of the rifle was swallowed by a fat tube, and that fat tube was the silencer itself, grown straight into the gun rather than screwed onto the end. Here is how the thing actually worked. 4 rows of tiny holes were drilled into the barrel, following the spiral of the rifling, and as the bullet raced forward, a slice of the hot gas shoving it got bled off through those holes early. That gas spilled into the wide chamber wrapped around the barrel, where it could spread out, cool down, and shed its pressure long before it ever reached open air. Whatever was left then squeezed through a second chamber packed with fine mesh screens, which tore the stream apart and bled off the last of its roar. So by the time the bullet slipped out the muzzle, most of the loud bang behind it had already been swallowed and tamed inside the tube. The report came out at about 130 decibels, which is roughly as hushed as a suppressed MP5 firing a dinky pistol round, except this thing was slinging a bullet twice the size. And that tube was not some bolt-on extra, because the gun was built around it and would barely cycle a second shot once it was stripped off, so the Vintorez was always by its very design a quiet weapon and never a loud one. The loudest noise the operator made was often just the clack of the bolt riding back and forth, not the shot at all. But that muffled bang was only half of what made the gun so eerie to be hunted by, because the bullet was already subsonic, so there was no whip crack chasing it through the air either, so the target usually had no clue which way the fire was even coming from. Now, you might wonder how something this stubby could still hit hard enough to matter, and the honest answer is a little unsettling. The Vintorez was tiny and light, tipping the scales under 6 pounds and measuring about 35 inches end to end, which is roughly the size of a short carbine. By the way, the name Vintorez means thread cutter, a fittingly understated label for a weapon designed to do its killing without a fuss. It usually fed from a curved 10-round magazine, though it could happily borrow the chunkier 20-round mags off its full auto cousin, the AS Val, whenever a job called for more. The two guns were practically siblings that shared most of their inner workings, with the Val built as a compact folding stock assault rifle for fast close quarters work, while the Vintorez stayed the scoped takedown marksman of the pair. Up top sat a side rail that took a normal daytime scope, the very same PSO sight bolted onto the famous Dragunov, or it could swap to a bulky night sight for working off the dark. On paper, that scope was marked all the way out to 400 meters, but the heavy round dropped like a brick the further it traveled, so in the real world an operator did his deadliest work inside about 200 meters. And here is the real party trick, because the whole rifle is stripped into 3 main pieces and dropped into a fitted aluminum briefcase, scope and night sight, and 2 spare mags tucked in beside it. The case was no bigger than something a businessman might carry into a meeting, which was rather the entire point. Folded away like that, an operator could walk into a town looking like any ordinary traveler, slip into a building, and have a loaded armor-piercing rifle assembled behind a darkened window in under a minute. And for the longest time, the very men it was built to kill had no idea the thing even existed. It was officially adopted in 1987, but built in such small numbers and guarded so tightly that for years it was little more than a question mark in Western files. This was a tool slipped only to the very sharpest end of the spear, the GRU and the KGB Special Forces, the men sent off to do the jobs nobody ever talks about. One more thing worth knowing is that it was actually select fire, so in a tight ambush, an operator could flip it to full auto and rake a group of men or a thin-skinned vehicle with a shower of near-silent bullets, though its real bread and butter stayed the patient single shot nobody heard. But spoiler alert, you already know a wonder weapon only earns its name once it actually goes to war, so let's break down where it drew first blood. The story is supposed to start is those dying days of the Soviet war in Afghanistan, except that chapter is a lot murkier than almost anyone lets on. The Soviet war there dragged on for nearly 10 years, and by the end of it, the Spetsnaz had become absolute masters of the nighttime ambush. They ran ambushes on mountain trails, jumped supply caravans in the dead of night, and tried to pick off enemy leaders without waking a whole valley full of fighters. A silent rifle that could fold a man at a couple hundred meters would have been a gift from heaven for that work, which is precisely why so many people simply take it for granted that it was there. And the dates almost shook hands, because the gun was adopted in 1987 and Soviet troops did not finish pulling out until 1989. So there genuinely is a window where a small batch could have been slipped to a handful of elite teams and tried out in real combat. But you see, could have and did are two very different words, and there are no captured examples from that war, no clear photographs from the front, and the soldiers who later wrote their memoirs barely said a word about it. Here is the genuinely fascinating part though, because that blank is not really a hole in the story, it is the story. A gun this hidden was never going to leave a tidy paper trail, so the silence sitting in the archive is really just the silence of the rifle itself, carried over into the history books. Well, whatever did or did not happen up in those mountains, the Vintorez was about to be handed a stage where its work would be impossible to hide. In 1994, Russia marched its army into the breakaway region of Chechnya, expecting a quick and tidy little win. What it got instead was a meat grinder, above all in the capital city of Grozny, where the fighting collapsed into some of the ugliest street combat seen anywhere since the Second World War. On New Year's Eve of 1994, the Russians shoved armored columns straight into the heart of the city, and Chechen fighters in the upper floors ripped them apart from above, turning whole streets into scrapyards of smoking tanks. After a bloodbath like that, the real fighting dropped right down to small bands of men picking their way through the ruins, and that is exactly where a weapon like the Vintorez came into its own. You see, in a place like Grozny, the fights happened nose to nose, across a road, through a blown out window, down a stairwell, hardly ever past a couple hundred meters. That short range was the exact sweet spot where the slow 9x39 rounds still landed like a sledgehammer, so the gun's one real weakness, its limited reach, simply never became an issue. So Russian special forces used it to take the defenders apart one careful piece at a time. Their favorite targets were the men who ran the war, the commanders calling the shots, the machine gunners pinning down whole streets, and the rebel snipers bleeding the Russian columns white. An operator could tuck himself behind a hole punched in a wall and quietly remove one of those key men, and the fighters around him would be left with no flash and no bang to trace it back to. By the time they grasped that one of their leaders had even gone down, the Russian assassin who did it had already dipped out the back door, and some of the soldiers on both sides of the conflict actually described the wrath it unleashed onto the Chechens. One Russian officer described it in chillingly matter-of-fact terms, calling it indispensable for city fighting at night and saying it let his men work as calmly as if they were standing on a practice range. Now flip that around and stand in the other man's boots for a moment. You are holed up in a building you reckon is safe. The night is dead quiet, and there are no rounds cracking past your head. Then the fighter right next to you simply folds, with no warning sound at all, and you have no idea whether there is one shooter out there or 10, or where on earth any of them are hiding. A loud firefight is terrifying too, but at least the noise tells you where to point your own gun and shoot back. Against this, there was nothing to aim at, only your mates dropping one after the other, while the dark around you stayed perfectly still. The armor-piercing SP6 round only sharpened that nightmare because a fighter in a captured vest felt safe right up until the instant that hardened steel core punched clean through it. But then something unexpected happened. The First Chechen War ended, but it wouldn't take long before the Russians drove straight back into Grozny, and with that, the VSS reappeared in an even more devastating form. That first war ended in a messy Russian retreat, but the calm never really had any legs. In 1999, the violence roared straight back, first spilling over into the neighboring Republic of Dagestan when armed bands pushed out of Chechnya that August, then erupting into the full-blown Second Chechen War. This time the Russians had swallowed some hard lessons, and the Vintorez rode in beside them, leaned on even harder than it had been before. The mission had shifted to counterinsurgency, hunting little bands of fighters holed up in ruins, villages, and mountain hideouts, and the rifle proved just as deadly clearing bunkers and running raids in the small hours. In that cramped fighting, it often got picked ahead of the long, loud Dragunov, simply because it was so much easier to carry and to hide. By now, the gun had grown from a rare ghost, slipped only to the most secret units, into a standard workhorse that scouts and assault teams reached for again and again. However, the Vintorez was about to be dragged into a different sort of war, a faster one, against a proper national army, and this time, the whole world would start paying attention. In August of 2008, a short and sharp war flared up between Russia and the small nation of Georgia over a breakaway strip called South Ossetia. It was all over in a handful of days, but for our rifle it turned into a real turning point, and for a slightly odd reason. This was the moment the Vintorez finally stepped out of the shadows. For 2 solid decades, the West had treated it as little more than a campfire rumor, and now, here it was, captured, photographed, and finally laid out on a table. When Western analysts first got their hands on those captured examples, there was a genuine scramble just to work out what they were even looking at. This quiet, briefcase-sized rifle firing a fat bullet that nobody in their own armies really used. What made them sit up even straighter is that both sides turned out to be carrying it. Russian special forces used the Vintorez on their fast border raids and snatch operations, the quick in and out jobs where surprise is the whole game. But the Georgians had a handful of their own as well, so for once the silent rifle was whispering on both ends of the very same fight. That short war proved the Vintorez was a serious frontline weapon that elite troops trusted with their lives, and from then on its legend spread well beyond Russia's own borders. But the gun's bloodiest stretch was still sitting in front of it, and it would soon turn up in war after war, right down to the present day in 2026. After Georgia, the Vintorez quit being a secret and settled in as a regular face in Russia's modern wars. It showed up in the fighting across Ukraine's Donbas region and in Crimea, where small teams put its hushed, armor-beating habits to work all over again. It surfaced in the Syrian Civil War too, where Russia backed the government side and quietly passed its 9x39 weapons along to allied troops. And when Russia launched its full invasion of Ukraine, the Vintorez was there from the opening days, slotted into Russian sniper sections right beside their long-range precision rifles. It has shown up constantly ever since, in trench raids and house-to-house clearing, and plenty of captured examples have even been turned around and put to work by Ukrainian troops. That pairing actually spells out exactly how the gun is meant to be played. A normal sniper rifle reaches far out across open ground, but it is loud, and it paints a target on the shooter the second he fires. So you bring the Vintorez for the close, quiet kills, the times you need a man dead at 200 meters with nobody hearing a thing, and you keep the big rifle for the long pokes downrange. These days, that heavy old round does struggle against the latest hard ceramic plates, which is one reason the Vintorez stays a specialist's tool rather than a rifle for every soldier. But inside a building or a tree line, where the shooting is close and stealth is everything, very little else can touch it. Meanwhile, the Russians never once stopped tinkering with the design. The newest model, the VSS M, ditches the old skeleton wooden stock for an adjustable metal one and bolts modern rails all over the gun so operators can clip on infrared lasers and night vision gear for fighting after dark, with deliveries running since 2018. And the Vintorez was only the beginning, because that fat 9x39 round went on to feed a whole family of Russian special weapons, from the stubby Vikra to the newer suppressed carbines still rolling off the line today. You see, that constant fiddling and upgrading is the real proof of how sharp the original idea was, because a bad design gets binned, while a great one just keeps getting reborn. And here is the thing that should really make you sit back and respect just how far ahead of its time this rifle truly was, because the West would not seriously chase the same recipe. A compact rifle firing a fat, heavy, subsonic round behind a built-in silencer until decades later, long after Soviet engineers had already nailed it. And here we are, all those years on, with the thing still being built, still being upgraded, and still carried into battle by a new generation of the soldiers it was first designed for. And that is why it keeps popping up in so many games and movies, because there is something genuinely haunting about a sniper rifle that kills in total silence. The games, though, can only ever show you the cool side of it, the slick reload, and the satisfying thump on the kill. What they can never put on the screen is the quiet that its victims actually died inside, that patient, invisible kind of death its designer set out to build from the very first sketch. For a weapon that does all of its work in a whisper, the Vintorez has somehow had a remarkably loud say in nearly every war Russia has fought across the last 30 years.